Good afternoon, Your Honors. Nelson Miller for the plaintiff, Mr. Foster. You'll know from the briefs filed in the case that this is an appeal of a ruling on summary judgment, and thus the very important review standard is one of de novo review. You'll be looking at the case afresh, and the court is well familiar with that standard. Summary judgment rulings are rulings of law to see if there's sufficient evidence for the case to go forward to the jury. And given that this is a legal question, not a determination or finding of fact, the court should give no deference to the ruling below, which I acknowledge was a dismissal of the case, a granting of the defendant Lincoln's motion for summary judgment. So we're looking at the matter anew, and it was the court's ruling that there was no evidence when in fact we had presented substantial evidence on the plaintiff's behalf, on Mr. Foster's behalf, on each of the elements of his claim. The court's ruling had to do with whether the defendant was or was not Mr. Foster's employer. If, in fact, the defendant Lincoln was Mr. Foster's employer, then Mr. Foster would have no claim, no tort claim against Lincoln. That claim would be barred by the exclusive remedy provision of the Workers' Compensation Act. But again, there was substantial evidence that the defendant Lincoln was not Mr. Foster's employer. And that begins with Mr. Foster's own affidavit, and then records that we produced, employment records in the case, clearly indicating that Mr. Foster was employed by a separate entity, a separate corporation, and the evidence just went on from there. So the important review standard is not to give any deference to the trial court's ruling, which Mr. Foster, the plaintiff, maintains here was erroneous, that in your fresh de novo review that you will reach the opposite conclusion and do so quite easily.